Is she on mute?
I was on mute, but I'm back, which is great. So welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Tayton, and I've been President of Stormwater Victoria for almost a year now. Can everyone hear me okay? Sorry. And hasn't it been a ride?
SpongeBob SquarePants.
Love SpongeBob SquarePants. Thanks, Leonardo.
I'm sorry. My kids are still talking. I just muted myself.
Thanks. No, it's life, and that's what we're at. You know, I stepped into this role after a few years on general committee and then some time in the exec. But it's not the first time I've played on Stormwater Victoria. You know, I've been involved in this for a few years before that. Some might say a glutton for punishment, but nah, I think it's good. I think it's good to share the load and engage and then re-engage and make it work where it suits your family. And just like Leonardo's family, we're in this sort of mix right now where we're certainly interwoven in our lives, our personal lives with our work lives. And it's certainly been an interesting transition in my home, but I think it's been pretty good. I think more opportunities have then presented themselves, and I'm generally excited about the future. From a Stormwater Victoria perspective, we've had to pivot and move and work out new ways to engage with the industry and still advocate for our members and our waterways. It's always good to remember our ultimate goal, which is to ensure we're working together to improve and protect our waterways while not losing sight of the bigger picture and the communities that are using them too. Now, let's not move past the flora, fauna, and also the people are the communities that are using our waterways. So we've got a broad spectrum of people looking into these things. So what are we doing? Well, Tracy's probably going to talk a bit about events towards later in this. One in particular is the Clearwater water drinks. I've booked my place and it's going virtual. So I'm still working out how to do my business on the top and my party at the bottom. So if anyone's got a hula skirt or something, they might want to send my way, you know, that'd be kind of good. But beyond the events, we're picking back up the newsletter concept again, which is really stemmed from our need to help our government partners like DELP and Melbourne Water to really extend their reach and circulate some really critical documents and guidelines that they've been working on. And we think it's important to get the message out and share the love. So stay tuned. That should be coming out your way in June. But one last thing I'd like to talk to you about is a bit of a personal agenda of mine. In fact, I'd like to kind of challenge you a little bit. Who here has looked at our waterways and water bodies and wondered how much better are they functioning with the reduced pollutant loads from us all staying home? We saw the photos of the great cities like Beijing, whose smog lifted and people saw clear skies for the first time in decades. For once, they could breathe easily and enjoy the great city, albeit maybe from the balcony or their home. So what we need now is evidence that showcases how the intense slowdown in our great city has bettered the condition of our waterways, how the fewer car movements, less trains and reduced flight numbers have generated a better environmental response. Where was the biggest improvement? Was it near your home? Was it near your workplace? Was it at your favourite fishing spot? Maybe the beach? Anyway, I'm keen to hear from all of you about how we can potentially put together a collaborative response and show society just how much a difference 2 months of us being in lockdown made to our waterways. Sorry, it's a bit of a personal agenda, but if you want to get in contact with me, my email address is back up and running now at president@stormwatervictoria.com.au. So if you want to get in touch, send me an email and show me where you've seen a change, and then maybe we can start getting this some more highlight across our industry. Now let's get into those presentations. Tracy, are you keen to take back over? Maybe off mute?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute there. Yep. All right, thanks, Jamie. I've got a few wigs that you can borrow if you need to sort out the dressing for the water drinks. All right, so I'd like to introduce the first two speakers who are both from Melbourne Water. That's Trish Grant and Sharon Ross Rakesh. Trish is currently working at Melbourne Water in a team of healthy river health caretakers for the waterways of Greater Melbourne. Trish's role is to help guide the translation of best available science to on-ground actions to protect river health in Melbourne, and so that the community goals of the Healthy Waterways strategies are met. Her background, Yep. Where's this gone? Sorry about that. Somewhere. Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, her background is in water quality, impacts of the catchment land use, waterway health, community education, and agricultural science. Sharon has a master's degree in fluvial geomorphology and has spent several years at the CRC for catchment hydrology in the late 90s. There she was collecting, analysing stormwater data for different waterways. At Melbourne Water, Sharon has had many different roles relating to waterway management, from condition monitoring, planning on-ground works, and developing new strategies and policies. She was instrumental to the setting up of the nitrogen offset program and the environmental significance overlay, so the ESO. Sharon has been heavily involved in the recent Healthy Waterways Strategy refresh and subsequent monitoring, evaluation, and reporting plan. So both speakers are very knowledgeable in this area, so please welcome them to the presentation stage.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So welcome everyone, and thanks very much for coming to our talk today. Sharon and I are going to be talking to you about how we derive the stormwater targets for the Healthy Waterways Strategy, and to provide a bit of context about you know, how we came up with these volumetric targets. Can we have the next slide, please, Sharon? So the Healthy Waterways Strategy has traditionally been a strategy that's focused on Melbourne Water's delivery against its waterways and drainage charge. The Healthy Waterways Strategy this time around is quite a different document. Some of you may know that Melbourne Water is the designated caretaker of river health in the Port Phillip and Westernport region, and that's the equivalent role to the catchment management authorities around the rest of Victoria. And as such, we were required to develop a strategy to guide the management of waterways. Melbourne's region is quite different in that we have a lot of people living in it, and so this strategy has placed a little bit more focus on the social values than previous strategies. Can we have the next slide, please? So what's new about the Healthy Waterways Strategy? So for the first time, it's been a unified strategy that includes rivers, wetlands, and estuaries. And stormwater, Melbourne Water had a separate stormwater strategy that's now been rolled into the combined Healthy Waterways Strategy. And so that's different. And then the other thing that's really different is that, as I said previously, our waterway strategy has always articulated what Melbourne Water's investment will be for waterways. But this time around, we decided to take the perspective of what does the waterway need primarily as our first point of view, and we co-designed it with the community. So we had over 250 groups of people that helped us co-design and set visions for the strategy on a catchment per catchment basis. And then we also we basically set the strategy with the waterways as the focus, so that other agencies that have an influence on waterway health can pin their tasks and their roles to the strategy. So that's a really different perspective. It's quite a game changer. The other thing that we did better this time was we had better engagement with our traditional owner groups. There are 3 registered Aboriginal parties in the region, and we ran a separate engagement process with them, and through that process they developed up some regional performance objectives to help integrate the traditional owner perspectives into waterway management. So the other thing that's different about this strategy is that it's now a 10-year strategy rather than a 5-year strategy, and that allows us a little bit longer time frame to get some traction against the targets. And it also allowed us to take a bit of a longer term perspective. So we identified 2 key threats to the region over the next sort of time frame, generation, if you like, and those are urbanisation and climate change. Melbourne is set to be a city of 8 million people by the time it becomes fully urbanised. 2051, I think, was the target. And over that time, that means a impervious surface change in our region is going to be quite significant. And so that's how, we set a long-term target of harvesting 80 gigalitres of stormwater and infiltrating 20 gigalitres at that full development phase. The other thing that's going to threaten this area is climate change, and that will result in a change in base flow conditions in our waterways. So in order to be able to combat that, we need to find 23 gigalitres of water over the next 10 years to help improve that situation. We also set targets for wetlands and estuaries, whereas we didn't really have explicit targets for those in previous strategies. Next slide, please. Have I missed a piece? I think there's a bit down the bottom I can't see. So at a catchment scale, this is what the targets all came together to look like. So this is the Werribee catchment, and you can see we set targets about increasing access to water for people to waterway corridors. We wanted to see that change by 34 kilometres. We set targets around increasing the environmental water reserve. We set targets to combat urbanisation and harvest and infiltrate stormwater. We set quite respectable targets around increasing vegetative buffers around streams. We set some objectives for wetlands and for estuaries as well. Next slide, please, Sharon. I think this is where you take over.
Yes, I'm trying to change the slide, but it's frozen. Oh. There we go. Thanks, Trish. I'm going to, I guess, now talk in a bit more detail specifically about how we develop the stormwater targets in the strategy. This first slide's just to illustrate that, I guess, we started off with what we call conceptual models that we developed for the environmental and social values that underpin the strategy that we've set long-term outcome targets for. And this is an example for macroinvertebrates. So it's a simple way to illustrate some very complex interactions that go on in our ecosystems and how things like physical form and the water regime and the water quality components all interact and what's needed to help support macroinvertebrate communities or platypus, fish and birds and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of technical detail and science and references and things like that sitting behind these. And for some of them, we've been able to develop more quantitative and predictive models as well. And I'll touch on that in a minute. But firstly, just to delve into the stormwater problem a little bit more deeply, as most of you probably already have a pretty good understanding of, but just to set the context for Melbourne, for example, comparing an undeveloped and a relatively developed catchment. So Olinda Creek's reasonably undeveloped with only about 3% of the catchment covered by hard surfaces like roads and roofs, and the resulting hydrograph that you can see down the bottom there shows, you know, there's fairly infrequent large events that occur during rainfall events, and you have a decent elevated base flow during winter and a reduced base flow in summer. Contrast that to the graph to the right, where you have a very different flow regime occurring in an urban catchment. So this is Brushy Creek, where 20% of the catchment is actually covered with impervious surfaces like roofs and roads that are directly connected to this waterway through conventional stormwater pipes. So that results in much more frequent large events. They're peakier, they're flashier. There's a much greater overall volume of water every year entering that stream, and we have reduced base flows and often no base flow in summer. And the pictures here really do paint the picture of a nice healthy stream with physical habitats intact, but once this flow regime's radically changed. We have destruction of physical habitats, and we have elevated pollutants and nutrient levels entering the streams, and the biodiversity significantly declines. And so here, just to, I guess, explain this a little bit further, it's a zoom in of one of those events on that graph, which the peaky one is obviously the urban hydrograph. That's a lot, has a higher peak discharge, it occurs quicker, and it's flashier compared to a more subtle, more attenuated flow hydrograph that you would see in an undeveloped catchment. So what's happening? You have a vegetated surface. When it rains, you get substantial evapotranspiration occurring. So we get a lot of water lost through to the atmosphere, and only a relatively small proportion actually infiltrates into the soil and contributes to that subsurface flow. And then in, extreme events, when you do eventually see some overland flow running off into the stream. So in an urban catchment, we replace that vegetated surface with an impervious surface. Pretty much 100% of it will turn into runoff when it rains. So we really do need to find ways where we can mimic that evapotranspiration component and harvest stormwater out of the catchment, find ways to infiltrate runoff into pervious surfaces to supplement that subsurface flow, so that we end up with the right amount of runoff and as natural as possible flow regime to these urban streams. And if we don't do that, then as you can see in this graph here, which is a macroinvertebrate index called LUMAR, which can tell us, whether or not our streams are in very good or very degraded condition. So we stand to lose over 500 kilometres of streams that are currently ecologically healthy, with the predicted amount of urban development predicted for Melbourne. So it's a pretty dire picture. So this problem of urban flows and the impact that it's happening, the science that we know about it, is really, I guess, shifting us in the direction of really putting the spotlight on how we manage flow regimes better in our urban streams. And so for the strategy, we were able to utilise some quite powerful predictive models that have been developed through our research partnership with the University of Melbourne, particularly Chris Walsh, Yung Chi, Reece Coleman and Nick Bond, who spent quite a few years wrangling our long-term biological monitoring data using quite sophisticated statistical techniques to relate environmental predictors such as climate, geology, vegetation, environmental predictors of our streams, coming up with the ones that pretty much relate the most powerful predictors of that biological condition, so that we can predict the occurrence of a particular species in a particular reach for our stream network across the region. So it's a big process of model fitting and selection and evaluation, so that we can produce, these models at the bottom that predict the occurrence of these species. And they're a powerful way in which we could communicate with our collaborators at workshops that we held in the development of the strategy to really show what our baseline was in 2016 and where we're heading under a business as usual future with climate change predictions and with the predicted urban expansion. So, we modelled a 1.5 degree increase in temperature and a 25% reduction in flow, and the expansion of urban development to the current predicted urban growth boundary. And as you can see, in this map here of the Yarra, red is an indication of very poor condition for macroinvertebrates, and we're getting significantly more streams that are in that red zone compared to the current state. What we were then able to do was play around with some different management scenarios of what would happen if we were able to undertake higher standards of stormwater protection into the future with greenfield development, if we were able to start to an existing development, and also scenarios around different levels of revegetation, different buffer widths of that vegetation, and what does the actual macroinvertebrate predictions look like under those different scenarios. So this slide on the left is a map showing different combinations of those management scenarios. So revegetation on its own, revegetation combined with treating just new stormwater runoff, or treating new and existing stormwater runoff. So those different combinations. We also had to build in costs of those different scenarios, and we used best available information around the unit cost of these particular interventions. And then we used another decision support tool called Zonation, which is a conservation planning tool that was developed in Europe, and it's been used quite extensively for large scale planning for conservation protection. It includes key elements of representativeness, irreplaceability and complementarity of species. So it's really an optimising tool that can tell you in the landscape where you're going to get your best bang for buck. And so the map on the right is a ranking of zonation that tells us which reach to really where we should start to focus our efforts first, given a certain amount of budget. So the darker the blue here, the greater the benefit we would see in our combined in-stream value benefits. So combining macroinvertebrates with fish and platypus, we can look at the most cost-effective action and where to start that action first. But it is just a model, so we had to overlay, the outputs of that model with some pragmatism and some other factors, such as existing commitments to some integrated water management that are occurring, for example, in the Northern Growth Corridor. We needed to make sure we were being mindful of certain threatened species across the region. We need to be mindful of the fact that we wanted to come up with some priorities for the 10 years of the strategy. And so we couldn't afford necessarily to invest in everywhere across the region in the first wave of this strategy. So really, in consulting with the experts and our collaborators and using these tools, we honed in on some priority catchments in our region where we thought some flow standards linked to the flow volumes that I was talking about before are really needed to try and ensure some protection and prevent further degradation of these waterways. And we wanted to come up with some targets in the strategy that were, easy enough to sort of comprehend and understand, but were also linked to these key causal factors in our flow regime. So the graph on the right here has been developed, and it's the name of the paper is there if you want to read into the detail of how these curves were derived. But essentially it can tell us the different rainfall bands across the region. What's the volume of runoff from one impervious hectare that we either need to infiltrate or to harvest? And so the grey is the band of volume that we should be infiltrating for a certain rainfall band, and then the black is the range that we should be harvesting. So we chose the midpoint of that line and applied it to the appropriate rainfall band in our region and those priority areas, and represented them as targets in the strategy. And this is how they're expressed, which is for each of those different priority areas, for every hectare of imperviousness, we need to harvest a certain amount of stormwater and infiltrate a certain amount. And the graphs here are the total amounts of harvesting and infiltration volumes for those priority catchments in each of our 5 major catchments. So the dark line is for ultimate development into the long-term future of development predicted for Melbourne versus estimates of what we think is likely to happen in the 10 years of the strategy. So, there's a significant amount in the Yarra, and then Werribee, and then Maribyrnong, and then Westernport in terms of harvesting. The infiltration volumes are obviously quite substantially less than the harvest volumes. So just to wrap up, that was a bit of a quick overview of how we went about developing pragmatic stormwater targets for the strategy using best available data and science and future scenarios, which enabled us to combine modelling, benefits and costing and balancing all of that with good pragmatism and sense, and making sure that they were translatable across our region, which has quite varying rainfall. So place-based targets that have, you know, a sound rationale. And back over to you, Trish.
So, coming back to the real world, it's how do we go about implementing these targets? And none of these images are going to be new to any of our audience because you know, you're all stormies. But this is the type of deal that can happen at a streetscape to help try and infiltrate some of the stormwater that comes off these new hard surfaces. Next one, Sharon.
Sure.
And then we've also, you know, got other options like, you know, harvesting water into rainwater tanks, using a leaky tank type scenario to get a little bit more infiltration and make sure those tanks have capacity for when it rains. And then, you know, installing large biofilters like we have down in the bottom picture at Wicks Reserve on Dobson's Creek. Next one. And the other option that we have is wetlands, which are larger scale treatment options. We're looking at a range of alternatives for these wetlands, like making them leakier so that they actually are infiltrating some of the stormwater that they capture and treat. Next one. And some of the recent work that's happened that will help with the implementation of these targets. Various agencies other than ourselves have led some of these things. So you will have all heard of the IWM forums that are being led by DELP, and these really are our principal way of getting people on board with the stormwater targets and you know, coming up with good ideas and options for fit for purpose alternative water use that may help us deliver some of these stormwater targets in priority areas. One of the things that we have done is tried to link the stormwater targets to the IWM KPIs that are being developed at the moment, so that they are able to, you know, they make sense and they track the same target over time. There's also been some work done to Eastern Water is wrong. I'm sorry that the wrong version of this slide's gone in. This is eWater has helped by instigating an upgrade to music. The Storm tool that some of you are going to be familiar with, that will help model flows from projects, whether you've met standards from projects, is also going to be developed and upgraded once the new stormwater guidelines have been finalised. There's also some work that Melbourne Water and DELP, or that DELP is leading, but Melbourne Water is involved in around the institutional arrangements on land management. So that's otherwise known as the 60 hectare rule. There's also been some updates to the source catchments model, also by eWater, not Eastern Water, that will help us be able to quantify water quality outputs from water quality objectives that have been met by meeting some of these stormwater targets. Melbourne Water's also done some work to develop up some prioritisation internally for how we might fund projects. And also we've been doing a lot of work with our customers to see how much of these stormwater targets do people want us to be delivering. So we're about to go to the Essential Services Commission for our next round of funding. So there's been a lot of work done on trying to work out what the appropriate level of request for funds is. And of course, you're about to hear in a few minutes from the EPA about the most recent work they've been doing on developing up new stormwater guidelines. Next slide, please. Another exciting thing is that those rainfall graphs that you saw in a previous slide have been taken up by the UDIA and integrated into this Enviro Development Certification Scheme, accreditation scheme. And you can see the table on the left-hand side of the slide, on the right-hand side of the slide, is just a different way of showing the data that sits behind those rainfall graphs that you saw earlier. So that's really exciting. There's already been 2 developments that have sought to meet those that accreditation scheme. Just an update from the rest of Melbourne Water about some of the projects that have been recently funded out of Living Rivers grants. So for Casey City Council, there's new streetscape development options being looked at, and some stormwater harvesting projects. For Yarra Rangers, they have won some money from us to trial some new porous paving, and we're also looking at working with them on some small-scale stormwater disconnection in some of the Yarra Valley townships. In Macedon Ranges, Bromsey, there's a WUSD investigation and concept plan being developed for the township of Bromsey, which is also in a stormwater priority area. And we're also at Melbourne Water developing up a new integrated incentives program aimed at achieving, more directly achieving some of the outcomes that the strategy points to. So this is not just stormwater grants, but also our other range of grants for rural land and for streamside zone revegetation. So, previously, these our Living Rivers grants have been more about building capacity within the stormwater management within the stakeholder, like in our partners. But now we're seeing that evolve into something that's a bit more, not totally focused on outcomes based, but certainly more linked to our strategy outcomes, as well as providing, continuing to provide some of that capacity building. Next slide, please, Sharon. So you can see that this is a complex space. So if we're going to get effective stormwater management, it's going to require a multiple approaches to meet these targets. We're going to need new policy to help support a higher standard. We're going to need the right incentives portfolio. We're going to need these voluntary standards such as the UDIA plus our new Melbourne Water incentives framework. We're going to have to look at how to get these new standards into development planning for urban growth, and so that we can effectively put controls in at a PSP level and get PSPs reviewed. We're going to, and Melbourne Water is going to have to do some effective capital investment to help drive some of these. And we're also going to look at alternatives for harnessing the market. So things like, offsets and other types of trading programs could play a role as well. So it's going to require all of this to come together in order for us to meet these targets. And if we don't, then conventional urban stormwater, the way it is at the moment, is going to mean that we're going to have more degraded streams over time. And we know clearly from our community that they don't want this. They want a higher standard. So so this IWM approach, where we're able to combine fit for purpose water with these stormwater outcomes to protect waterways, is probably our most likely way forward. But thank you, everyone, and I'll hand over now to our next speakers. Oh, no, we've got questions.
Hi, thank you for that, Trish and Sharon. I think we've run out of time for questions.
Have time.
But what I'm going to do is if people have questions, I'll collate them in that question and answer panel, and we can send them out as an email, or we can put them in the newsletter. That's what I was thinking. Our next presentation is from the EPA. sorry. Okay. Sigourney, it's presented by Sigourney and Leon. Sigourney is a senior policy officer in the water team at EPA Victoria and is currently managing the development of new stormwater management guidelines. Yep. She is experienced in regulatory reform and has been involved in reviewing permissioning and noise regulation and also developing the subordinate legislation under the new Environmental Protection Act. Leon is a principal expert in land waters at EPA Victoria and has been with the EPA for more than 30 years. He was part of the 2013 and 2014 review of stormwater BEPM and has dealt with many impacts from stormwater in his time at the EPA and continues to be involved in research on stormwater impacts. He has been Victoria's representative on the team managing the review of the National Water Quality Guidelines. It sounds really interesting. Please welcome Sigourney and Leon.
Thanks very much, Tracy. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. So, yeah, my name's Sigourney Irvine. I'm project manager of a project to review the 1999 BEPM and develop new guidelines that will support improved stormwater management. I'm here today with my team leader of water policy, Leonardo Ribon, and my colleague, Leon Metzling, who is EPA's principal expert in inland waters, who will also be speaking today. Thanks for having us to do a short update on EPA's upcoming and recent stormwater work in the current context, and also how we're supporting Healthy Waterways Strategy and broader government policy regarding stormwater. Yep, I'll first give a bit of an introduction, then Leon will talk to you about our review of urban stormwater science. Then we'll talk a bit to the development of draft guidelines underway, and I'll speak to EPA's new environment protection legislation. So the current urban stormwater best practice environmental management guidelines was published in 1999. It's fair to say that the science has progressed quite significantly since then over the past 20 years, particularly regarding the significant risk of harm from stormwater flows, which is a key gap in the 1999 guidelines. So it's important to fill this gap and also support priority government policies and strategies, including Melbourne's Healthy Waterways Strategy, as well as things like Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan and Water for Victoria. A consistent theme in these policies is the need to improve Victoria's urban stormwater management framework to reduce the harm caused to receiving waters from stormwater. The policies indicate that Victoria is moving from a focus on urban drainage to this broader approach that considers how stormwater can be managed to contribute to healthy and resilient urban environments. So with an established need to have a look at current guidelines, this shows an overview of the process we're following to try and develop new guidance. We've started with a review of the urban stormwater science. So the last time that the science was looked at was in 2014. So the present review took that as a baseline and considered what has happened since then and what else we need to know. With the science and a lot of direction from government, including things like the Stormwater Ministerial Advisory Committee, we've gone on to identify and look at objectives that would support protecting environmental values and improved stormwater management, and also help to characterise likelihood and consequence of impacts. It's important to note that through these stages, we've had amazing support from and collaboration with our colleagues in Melbourne Water and the department and local government. This process is ensuring that the review is considering both scientific and policy perspectives and is grounded by our partners. We're now almost ready to start testing a draft and hopefully do some more consultation. So Leon is now going to talk to the review of urban stormwater science. So I'll just mute myself and pass over to you, Leon.
Thanks, Sigourney. Hope everybody can see or hear me okay. I'll just touch on some of the science aspects, and we'll finish up talking about the science review. I always like to start with this sort of slide, but I think we all understand the type of the problem that urban stormwater causes, the peakiness of flows and the loss of the long-term contribution to water, to the flows in the creek. Next slide, please, Sigourney. I'll just briefly touch on some of the recent work we've been doing, where we've partners in a research project being led by Monash Uni and the University of Sydney, where we're looking to better understand the nature of stormwater that runs off the urban land and feed that into a modelling platform. Some of you may know it's called Urban Beats. So we've essentially been trying to beef up the water emissions side of it by getting a better relationships of urban landform with the quality of the water that runs off them. We published a paper last year which contains some of these analyses, and they're just a little bit shown here. In some ways it reinforces what we know, but it just provides us with some stronger numbers in which to base future modelling and perhaps some planning. If you look at the charts in the right-hand column, they're dealing with some of the metals, zinc, copper, nickel. And the box and whisker plots deal with different landform types. To the right of the graph in green or brown, there's forested or agricultural areas. And you can see the metals are pretty much absent or close to absent. They're present because there'll always be parts of soil and stuff. So, but much, much lower than in the urban areas. Then if you go to the the left-hand chart column where you've got suspended solids, total phosphorus and total nitrogen, you can see that it shows a number of points. One of them is that it's incredibly variable, the concentrations that we find running off these different land use types. The dark bars are for industrial, yellow for low density residential, and the blue for the medium density residential. Agriculture can contribute plenty of sediment and plenty of nutrients, so that's, agricultural land can be major sources of these. Forested lands is always much, much better, of course. But you can also get high levels of nutrients such as total phosphorus in the Cherry Creek example. And the take-home message for me was that some of the low-density residential can have pretty high levels of sediment. Maybe it's a reflection of the developments that are underway there, where there's early stages of construction can be major sources of sediment input. So this is feeding into that modelling platform, and I think that'll be useful in the future. Again, it's just basically, I think, reinforcing or better defining the problem that we're probably all aware of. Next slide, please, Sigourney. You may have seen graphs or charts like this, where this is based on Melbourne Water's monitoring network data, and we basically scaled the exceedances of the water quality objectives for metals. And I guess it's clearly demonstrating the nature of the problem with green, the various greens indicating good or very good out in the non-urban areas, and as soon as you hit the urban areas, it becomes really bad. This is just for metals, but similar stories for some of the other contaminants such as the nutrients and suspended materials. So I guess it's just we report on this pretty much every year, and the picture doesn't change too much. And I think it's an indication that we've got quite a long way to go on this. Next slide, thanks, Sigourney. Okay, as Sigourney mentioned, we commissioned a bit of an update in the science following the 2013-14 review, just to tick off whether there'd been any, what were the major changes or significant changes we needed to take into account when we were approaching a revised guidance in the last year or two. So we commissioned some work by the CRC for water sensitive cities, led by Jamie Ewart and contributed by others. And basically they focused on, they produced a report around focusing on about 5 different aspects. And we hope to produce this, publish this report later this year. They did note that there's an increased, since the last review was done, there's been an increased focus on the social values of waterways. This links to the perspectives that Trish and Sharon were talking about, how with Healthy Waterways Strategies, there's been for a while the values recognised for macroinvertebrates, fish, platypus, those sorts of things, but now there's increased focus on the social aspects. This recent review also, I guess, documented the support for more place-based approach. Now, we've always had an approach which recognises that different places are different. You know, the set objectives for water quality, which covers the whole state, has 5 different regions which are in recognition that streams differ and according to where you are. And so conceptually, this is what we've been doing, and I think that's a great thing to have, that places are different, and so not the same objectives should be applied. You need to develop ones which are specific to the local needs. The third point was looking at the water quality aspects of it, and I know in the 2013-14 review there was a real strong desire to include targets based on bacteria such as E. coli, or deal with pathogens in some way, and also on metals, because there was such an obvious and well documented problem from the monitoring. But I guess the decision point back then, and was reinforced in this most recent review, that the science is not there to enable objectives to be set for these other types of issues, such as bacterial, bacto, or for metals. And so we've stuck with the existing water quality indicators of total nitrogen, total phosphorus, TSS, and litter. So that's kind of disappointing in a way, because we recognise the problems that certainly stormwater has in delivering bacterial contamination to, say, bay beaches and also the other waterways. But we're just not able to include that at the moment. The report also goes into the performance of the treatment measures, noting that they're pretty variable and that an integration of approaches is important. Next slide, please. The final point was probably one of the major parts of the report, which is the focus on flows. And it's no surprise that confirmed that flows are critical to urban waterways. Went into quite a bit about the metrics, because there's lots of different ways and lots of different indicators for measuring flow and the importance of flow to aquatic ecosystems. It ended up settling on sticking to the mean annual runoff volume, which I think comes out of music and has been used in the past. There are other indicators which have, equally valid for different reasons, and I'm sure we can move in between them. But the review ended up being fairly agnostic about it, just saying it's mean annual runoff is an effective indicator and is also easily calculated. So let's leave it at that. The review talked about the numbers for flow reductions that had been discussed or proposed in the 2013-14 review, and that was the 25% for existing urban areas, but that a higher flow reduction was needed for higher value waterways. It talked about a couple of, from various studies which had indicated it might be 50%, or it might be somewhere in the order of 80 or 90%, depending on rainfall and the basic climate characteristics. It didn't specify any particular number within that range, but that was a general, I guess the indication was that significant flow reduction needs to occur if you're going to protect high value waterways. So next slide. So we're in the process of producing draft guidance, which, as Sigourney mentioned, we're pretty advanced on. One of the things we're going to settle on is maintain the water quality objectives. So for the TN, TP, and TSS, they will, like our draft approach at the moment is to keep them as they are. But we will include flow reduction objectives, and we'll propose as the science review documented, the 50 to 90% reduction from the high ecological value waterways. And these are ones which are identified as that in the Healthy Waterways strategies. For other areas, there'll be the 25% reduction and a 10% minimum flow contribution. So these proposed or draft objectives aim to address the gaps identified in the science review, particularly the flow. And it also allows for the place-based approach, because when we say 50 to 90%, that will depend on where you are. If you're into a more wetter, highly, more water in the system, you may need less reduction. If you're in the drier, west and north of the Melbourne metro area, you probably need a higher flow reduction. And that's it from me. So I'll hand back to Sigourney at that point.
Thanks very much, Leon. Excellent. So here's just wanted to show you some draft examples of some of the types of supporting materials we've been trying to develop to help show what different flow reduction solutions could potentially look like, and highlighting the various benefits such as enhancing blue and green elements, cooling and greening, reducing pollutants and flow volumes. So showing the treatment solutions, for example, this one here showing a swale, rain garden, rainwater tank in a typical single lot development, and treatments that are reducing flows as well as pollutants. We're looking at developing about 10, looking at other development types. They've got a couple here just as examples. Different sorts of developments and different sorts of treatment solutions. So taking a step back, it's important to be aware of the environment protection reforms taking place. And this is very important context for us to consider and gives us a clear steer on approach and content when it comes to drafting guidance. So the Environment Protection Amendment Act 2018 will transform Victoria's environmental protection laws and EPA. It amends the new 2017 Act with key content such as a general environmental duty. The government has developed the new Act in response to the independent inquiry into EPA. It is now intended to commence 1st of July 2021, so a bit over a year from now. EPA is shifting to a framework that is predominantly focused on prevention, and the reforms represent a fundamental shift in environment protection in Victoria, a move to preventing harm from waste and pollution rather than responding to it after it has occurred. The primary objective is to reduce harm and the risk of harm to human health and the environment. And in line with this, guidance has an important role to play to help support stakeholders to understand risks of harm and how to prevent harm. So at the cornerstone of the new scheme is the General Environmental Duty, which is a new concept for Victoria's environment protection laws. The GED requires business, industry and the community, anyone conducting an activity that poses risks to human health and the environment, to understand and minimise those risks. General duty-based regulation is well understood. A general duty sits at the heart of occupational health and safety laws in Australia, and it is an approach that's well understood and supported by the business community. The general duty concept is quite simple in terms of the steps shown on this slide. So, for example, first, needing to understand the risks that pollution or waste from an activity might present to human health and the environment. Secondly, the ways those risks can be controlled need to be identified and understood. Then the requirement to put in place any reasonably practicable methods or controls to eliminate the risk. And finally, if the risks can't be reasonably eliminated, there's the requirement to put in place any reasonably practical risk mitigations to reduce the likelihood of the harm arising. In terms of understanding what is meant by so far as reasonably practicable, if you see Section 6 in the Environment Protection Amendment Act 2018 outlines some key factors which are likelihood, degree of harm, what the duty holder knew or ought reasonably to have known about the risk and its means of control, the means of control being available and suitable, and also the cost of control measures being proportionate to risk. So the third dot point around referred to as state of knowledge is a key one which I'll talk about a bit more now. So in terms of EPA reforms, guidance is relevant to the state of knowledge, and guidance we're developing will support state of knowledge for the purposes of the GED as shown on the previous slide. So the expression state of knowledge describes the body of accepted knowledge that is known or reasonably to be known about the harm or the risks of harm to human health and the environment, and also what is known about the controls for eliminating or reducing those risks. So put simply, it means under the GED, you're required to have reasonable knowledge about the risks your activities pose and how to address them. It's also important to note that state of knowledge is not just EPA guidelines. So obtaining this knowledge means drawing on reliable and reputable sources. We would expect businesses to be drawing this information from a range of sources, including business and industry knowledge, independent organisations knowledge, regulatory and government agency knowledge. And the Healthy Waterways Strategy would help form an important part of state of knowledge too, and particularly regarding recognition of the harms from stormwater flows. State of knowledge will be dynamic and it will develop over time as new technology, systems, processes develop or where there's an emerging risk. So just a bit on some of the other work. Other than the new primary legislation, we've also have developed draft subordinate legislation, which you can find at the first link. And also one new tool under the Act that you may be interested in is orders for managers of land or infrastructure called OMLIs. So agencies managing land or infrastructure may be subject to an order that sets out their duties complementing the general environmental duty. While there were no OMLIs proposed to be made in the draft subordinate legislation for when the Act takes effect, in the coming years there may be scoping of potentially some OMLI work which may be relevant for stormwater. So some clauses of the SEP waters, the State Environment Protection Policy for waters, were proposed to be saved. For example, regarding on-site wastewater management and some stormwater ones in transitional regulations for 2 years. So for example, council's responsibility for stormwater management planning, and that will be analysed and could potentially be translated into an OMLI. So in summary, just some of the key points, the General Environmental Duty and the Environment Protection Amendment Act are intended to take effect July 2021. Guidance is being developed and new guidance helps to support state of knowledge under the EP Act. Also, the Victoria planning provisions reference to the 1999 BEPM is static, so when we publish new guidelines, it doesn't automatically change this reference and compliance requirements under the separate Victoria planning provisions. However, there'll be some further investigation into looking into developing potential minimum compliance requirements with some further consultation. And just to reiterate, yeah, the key gap around and the problem of stormwater flows. In our next steps, we're looking to do some more targeted consultation with stakeholders and moving towards publishing a draft with some supporting materials for comment. So if you'd like to receive key updates on the review, such as when a draft is ready for comment, please send us an email. Thanks very much for having us, and I'll hand it back to Tracy.
Thanks, Leon and Sigourney, for that. We've got a few questions. I know we're running out of time, but maybe a few questions would be good. I like this one. It's by Belinda Lovell, and she asks, how will the GDE interact with construction sites and their associated stormwater impacts, and does it apply to private land?
So the GD applies to anyone engaged in an activity that may give rise to risk of harm to human health or the environment. So engaging in construction activities, there would be the requirement to minimise risk of harm there. And I know where the EPA is also developing further construction guidance underway by our industry guidance unit as well.
Okay, and I think this is a more a question for anyone on the panel. Does the update of the BEPM require any Melbourne Water drainage drainage scheme to be reviewed for new volume targets? Do you envision that there will be a rate where the runoff will be the target, like there is for nitrogen? Oh, Trish, I think, oh no, Sharon, I think you're on mute still.
Oh yeah, sorry. Look, I don't think we have a definitive answer for that yet. I think Melbourne Water's in the process of understanding where this new guidance is heading and what it means, how it relates to the targets set in the Healthy Waterways Strategy, and then working with our partners in the development industry to understand how we're going to shift from our current standards that we require in our developer services schemes to a higher standard, and how much, who pays and to what level, and all of that detail hasn't been resolved. So it's a work in progress, and I think some more conversations with EPA, Melbourne Water and the development industry is going to be needed to come to a common ground around that. So sorry, I don't have a definitive answer at the moment.
Okay, cool. I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions. I'll put these questions together and I'll get the panelists to answer them, and we'll email out the responses, or we'll put them in, and we'll probably put them in the newsletter that's coming up. So, and there's still more opportunities to ask questions. Just feel free to ask them in the Q&A panel. So I've got some quick closing remarks. We've got a few more events coming up, all of which are socially distanced to, I guess, keep us safe, but also social. So next week, we're going to have the second part of this series, looking at the implementation and the technical side to the Healthy Waterways Strategy. And it might actually answer some of the questions that have been raised in the panel, Q&A panel. So next week we'll have Daniel Fokins and Georgie Wittenhall talking and sort of like a response to today's overview. Following that, the week after, on the Thursday, which is the 4th of June, we have our networking water drinks with Clear Water. That's going to be hosted by Ross Allen, and we'll have it'll be a lot of fun, and it's BYO drink, so you bring your own drink. We dress up, as Jamie said, and we'll have some sort of game or competition. I can't remember what's exactly it is, but it sounds like a lot of fun. So please register for that through Clearwater. We also have following this webinar, a July webinar. It's going to be on smart technology and talking tanks for water conservation, flood management, and environmental base flow. So it'll look at smart technology that we can use in the future. So have a look out for that, those events that are coming up in this year. Please also suggest, if you have any topics that you think that we should cover, please suggest those in the survey that's at the end of this webinar, or let myself know, and we'll do what we can to address that. We also have this year, we also have our speaker gifts are donations to WaterAid Australia. That goes towards cleaning, getting clean water and facilities to communities that don't have them. So thanks again to our speakers and panelists. And also I'd like to thank Jess and Gems for putting this all together. I hope you have a good afternoon. See you.